The Jōkyō uprising, or the Kasugi uprising, was a large-scale peasant uprising that happened in 1686 in Azumadera, Japan. Azumadera at that time was a part of the Matsumoto domain under the control of the Tokugawa shogunate. The domain was ruled by the Mizuno clan at the time. Numerous incidents of peasant uprising have been recorded in the Edo period, and in many cases the leaders of the uprisings were executed afterward. Those executed leaders have been admired as gemin, non-religious martyrs, with the most famous gemin being the possibly fictitious Sakura Sogura. But the Jōkyō uprising was unique in that not only the leaders of the uprising, but also a 16-year-old girl who had helped her father, the deputy ringleader, were caught and executed. On top of that, the leaders of the uprising clearly recognized what was at stake. They realized that the real issue was human rights abuse, because the newly raised tax level was equivalent to a 70% tax rate, an impossible rate. Amazingly, though, the Mizunos compiled Shumputoki, an official record of the Matsumoto domain about 40 years after the uprising. This Shumputoki is the major and credible source of information concerning the uprising. Background: for several years there had been crop failure caused by severe winters. Azumadera farmers had suffered from this and many people had starved to death. Poverty was rampant. Under the circumstances, some households had to sell their daughters to brothels, and others had to kill newborn babies. Some village heads like Tadakasugi and Wanazembe tried to relieve the farmers' suffering by giving away rice from their own storehouses. But their acts of righteousness were met with a harsh reprimand from officials in Matsumoto. Tadakasugi was fired as the headman of Nakagaya village, and Wanazembe was fired as the headman of Nire village. Then in the fall of 1686, the domain government raised taxes to an exorbitant level. The reason for this tax rise was that the domain government needed more money. The domain lord of Matsumoto was a Fudai daimyo, who was obligated to perform many duties, and therefore had to spend a lot of money. The domain lords of neighboring Takato and Takashima were not under such pressure to perform such duties. Even though they used to be a part of the Matsumoto domain, they collected lower taxes from their people. When Azumadera farmers were notified of the tax rise, the atmosphere among tax collectors and peasants became tense, for their neighbors didn't have to pay the same amount of taxes. The event. Secret meetings. In October 1686, Tadakasugi summoned a dozen trustworthy farmers to a secret meeting held at a local Kumano shrine. The sacred place was an appropriate venue for discussing the issue of peasants' survival. After a series of such meetings, Tadakasugi and his followers came to the conclusion that appealing to the magistrate's office in Matsumoto was inevitable. They decided to do so even though they knew that to appeal was forbidden. Married men divorced their wives and sent them back to their parents' homes. They then prepared a letter of appeal of 5 articles. In the letter they humbly asked for a tax reduction. The 5 points of the letter of appeal were: 1. Rendering rice tax after processing is too much of a burden. 2. We ask for a reduction of rice tax to the level of those of 2 neighboring domains. 3. Concerning the part of rice tax collected in the form of soybeans, half of which is collected in cash, we ask that the tax money be calculated based on the price of rice, not on the price of soybeans. 4. Concerning the obligation of transportation of rice, we ask that the obligation be reduced to transporting it only as far as the domain limits. 5. Concerning the personnel cost of local and Edo officers, which we are obligated to shoulder, we ask that the obligation be cancelled. Appealed to the magistrate's office early on the morning of October 14, Tadakasugi and Wanazembe, along with their followers, went to the magistrate's office outside Matsumoto Castle, and handed in the letter of appeal. What they had not expected was that a huge crowd of farmers would gather and intimidate the officials. Kasugi and his followers had started this out as a peaceful mission. But when word spread that they were appealing, thousands of peasants flocked to the castle, some of whom stormed shops and the castle gate. The domain lord, Mizuno Tadanao, was away in Edo for Sankan Kotai at the time, so the executives had to deal with the situation themselves. Their biggest concern was how much this incident would negatively affect the position of the Matsumoto domain. Thousands of farmers were camping out in the cold outside the castle. On the night of October 16, the domain government issued a response paper signed by 2 magistrates. When the news of the response paper spread, the majority of peasants who had gathered around Matsumoto Castle went home. But Kasuke and his followers were not satisfied with the response. They lingered behind. They were so determined to get a satisfactory answer that they stayed 2 more nights outside the castle. At last 5 executives signed the second response paper responding favorably to the farmers' appeal. The documents granted the farmers' wishes to decrease the tax. Kasuke went home along with his followers. On October 18, the incident was settled peacefully. Evasive tactic, but it turned out that the response documents signed by the executives were a tactic used to settle the rebellion. A month later, Kasuke and other leaders of the uprising were arrested. The response documents were confiscated. Kasuke and his followers along with the male members of their families were executed without trial. Wana Zembe's daughter, Oshion, was responsible for delivering invitations to secret meetings at the Kumano shrine. She was also executed. 28 farmers were executed in all. The executions took place on November 22 at 2 separate locations. One execution site was at Saitaka and the other was at Idegawa. 17 farmers from the north of the castle were taken to Saitaka. Kasuke, Zembe, and Oshion were among them. 11 farmers from the south of the castle were taken to Idegawa. Kasuke is said to have shouted out for lowered taxes when he was tied to the execution pole. Matsumoto Castle had been built with a structural defect which caused it to lean. Influence on Gu Minkan Undo. The uprising has been perceived as a struggle for the right to life, and thought to be a forerunner for the Gu Minkan Undo. This movement swept across the nation in the 1870s and 1880s. The bicentennial anniversary of the Jōkyō uprising was observed in an atmosphere of excitement over the movement. Matsuzawa Kyusaku, a newspaper journalist from Azumadera, wrote a play based on the uprising, giving it a title Minkan Kagami Kasuke no Omokage. Incidentally, Matsuzawa died in prison exactly 200 years after Kasuke and others had been executed. Giminzuka. In 1950, at a construction site near Saitaka Shrine in Matsumoto City, a human body was found. In the next few weeks, additional bodies were found. The number of the unearthed bodies came to 18. 17 bodies were clustered, and one was found apart from the rest. 4 of the 17 bodies were headless, which coincides with the story handed down by tradition. And one of the 17 clustered bodies had a larger pelvis and slender bones. Taking these into consideration, historical and medical researchers of the time concluded that it was highly possible that the 17 clustered bodies were those of the executed farmers of the Jōkyō uprising. In 1952, the bodies were buried in a mound, and the mound has been called Giminzuka. Every year on the anniversary day of the executions of the Gimin, a memorial service is held in front of the mound. Then questions arise as to the whereabouts of the bodies of the farmers who had been executed at Idegawa execution site. It is widely believed that the 11 bodies have been washed away by river water, for the execution site was on the bank of the Tagawa River. When Giminzuka was built, some soil from the former Idigawa execution site was used in the construction. The Jōkyō Gimin Memorial Museum. After the 300th anniversary of the uprising, Azumino people founded in 1992 a memorial museum in honor of the uprising. The museum, Jōkyō Gimin Memorial Museum, has a plaque with the inscription of the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and another plaque with the inscription of the 11th and 12th articles of the Constitution of Japan, in both English and Japanese. They stand on each side of the main entrance to the building. The museum is located right across the street from the former Tada family homestead. List of references. Toba Toru, Chuo-sen. Self-published, c. 1983 Tsukada Masakimi, Giminshiro ni Sakebu, Shinkyo Shappenbu, 1986 Kodama Kota, Nippon Shinempyo Chizu. Yoshikawa Kobunkan, 1995 ISBN 978-4-642-09504-4. Hosaka Satoru, Hyakusho Ikita Sono Saho, Yoshikawa Kobunkan. 2002 ISBN 978-4-642-05537-6. Tanaka Kaoru, Jōkyō Giminiki no Jitsuzo, Shinmei Shoseki Shopping Center. 2002 ISBN 4-88411-005-6. Sato Makoto al.